hello there. Is that the amazing, the notorious ORB that I see with us today?
That's right. That's right. Some people confuse me for RBG, Ruth Bader
Yeah,
Ginsburg, a blessed
a lot
memory,
of
but no, I am
similarities.
the
Hmm.
notorious ORB. I have come here to lay down the law and give my opinion on issues of great importance.
Okay. Well, it's actually perfect that you're here today because we're going to be discussing. A couple of months ago, the DIBCAC came out with a list of the top other than satisfied controls that they've seen in assessment. So this is actually kind of perfect that you're here
Right. Well, I am
to
very much, as a judge, into the specific meaning of words. I have been known to concentrate on a word for an hour to get just the right meaning. And when DCMA goes to the trouble of noting which words are not being completely satisfied as they are meant to, I feel it's an important thing that we should double down on.
Yeah, I agree. Especially compliance is very similar to the law because I mean, in this case, it is the law. So there's a lot of writing that's very similar, definitely. So we will love to have. Yeah, thank you. We'll love to have your legal mind in when talking about this stuff. That would be great. Thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. Um, So, the legal authorities at DCMA, the Defense Contract Management Agency, have told me that this is the top 10 list of NIST 800-171 version 2 requirements that are OTS, lots of three-letter acronyms today, other than satisfied. Um, and this seems like it would be, as I do like to go into things in detail, seems like today we might just want to go through the first three, and ORB will come back for another visit to
Oh,
go through the
great.
rest of the ones.
That's a great idea. I like the idea of chunking it out because then that way we can get a little bit more in depth in some of them.
Right, right. And depth and analysis is what is key to understanding what the law is.
Absolutely.
So let us
Absolutely.
be very precise. There were a number of reviews by the DCMA of contractors at the time that this was published, and they had a list of the top 10 requirements that defense contractors were having trouble in meeting. And the
Mhm.
one that was the most difficult for them to meet was 3.13.11, which is FIPS-validated cryptography.
Mhm.
Now, what can you tell me, Mrs. Vestal, about FIPS-validated cryptography?
I'm really glad that you asked because it's interesting. When this came out, the first thought I had was, well, wow, Prevail's got this in the bag. So, what FIPS validated cryptography means is you have to ensure that your CUI at rest and in transit. So, that means if it's being sent somewhere, if it's being saved somewhere, or if it's just sitting, in a file somewhere that you have saved on your computer, it has to be in a FIPS validated cryptographic way that it is secured. What that means is specifically FIPS 140-2. So FIPS it's a federal program of creating sort of a verification for different types of encryption. So FIPS 140-2 encryption has to be applied to, again, data at rest and in transit if you have CUI, FCI, ITAR, that type of thing. And if you don't have FIPS 140-2, then obviously you're going to be out of compliance and other than satisfied on 3.13.11. Now, here's the really interesting part about this control. And it doesn't surprise me actually, because I know it sounds like that's a pretty straightforward response, right? Oh, okay, I just get a technology that has FIPS 140-2 validated cryptography and I'm good to go. Well, in some ways, yes, but in other ways, no. So, in the ways not is that the word validated. Now, I don't know about you, ORB, but when I look at the word validated, I'm just like, oh, I just have to validate that it's FIPS.
No, you have to go in front of a judge and make sure it's validated.
Oh, okay. Well, or in this case, it's slightly different in compliance, but kind of the same idea. You have to go to the NIST laboratories, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and you have the company that you are using. So whatever company you're using to do that cryptographic protection, that FIPS validated cryptography, you have to make sure that they have a certification from the NIST laboratories stating very clearly how it was used, is FIPS 140-2 active in the way that you're using it, and having that certification number from the NIST laboratory. If you do not have a certification number from the NIST laboratory, you will fail this control. So let me just say that again. You have to have a certification from the NIST laboratory stating that whatever you're using for the protection of CUI is FIPS 140-2 validated with NIST. So it can't just be a company that says, well, sometimes it uses FIPS and sometimes it doesn't. It has to be for the whole module that you are using, and there has to be certification. So that's the validation part of this. And unfortunately, it just isn't explained very well in the documentation. So it does not surprise me at all that this was the number one most missed control, because the word validated isn't defined.
And so, what a defense contract will need to do in order to meet this control is make sure that whatever technology they use for protecting their data is FIPS validated. And how do they ensure that?
That's a great question. So, and it's FIPS 140-2 validated. It's very specific. So what you have to do is actually, you can look it up on the NIST website, and they'll actually show you that like there's all the certification numbers there. In fact, like for example, Prevail has one of those. And so I could actually, let's see. So our certification is with, I just have to see, I'm sorry, I have to double check. Let's see. So it's called the Computer Security Resource Center, and the type of certification is the Cryptographic Module Validation Program, or the CMVP. And you have to have a certification with them, just like we do here at Prevail. And so we can put a link in the show notes to the one from Prevail, and then you can actually just look up anything from that site. No problem at all.
They never tell you in judge school that these outfits are itchy.
I bet they are. I mean, aren't they all made out of wool, and it's summertime right now? That's got to be so hot.
Yes.
Yikes. Well,
so we have well discussed and defined 3.13.11. I rule that it is closed. Let us discuss the next docket. 3.5.3, multi-factor authentication. Now, I'm going to say that multi-factor authentication describes the process of taking various individual technologies, whether that be a cell phone, whether that be your computer, whether that be your smartwatch, whether that be a password, and trying to ensure that you use at least two of those technologies in order to ensure your identity.
Interesting. You're actually, yeah, that's actually a really good explanation. I'm impressed, ORB. I didn't know you knew about cybersecurity stuff.
Yes, well, I read things very deeply to make sure I understand what they intend to say and what they are trying to say, and try to convey that to the reader.
Well, you've done an excellent job here, because exactly like what you just said, multi-factor authentication is the requirement of two or more different factors. So there's three different groupings of those factors. There's something you know, there's something you have, or there's something that you are. So when I say that, something you know, a password is a good example, or some like a PIN number that you have for your ATM card, like that would be a good example of something that you have in your brain, something you know. Something that you have is like your example, your cell phone. If you're going to get a text message alert from a multi-factor authentication, or if there's an application you're using, a multi-factor authentication application. A lot of us out there probably have at least one of them on our phones right now. So that would be an example of something you have, like you physically have it in your possession. The third one is something that you are. So like, for example, a biometric reading of some kind. Whenever you take your finger, if you have a laptop that reads your fingerprint, that is a biometric, that is something that you are. So you have to have a combination of 2 out of the 3, just like you said, so you could have one thing that you know and one thing that you are, or one thing that you know and one thing that you have, or one thing that you have and one thing that you are, or whatever. But you have to make sure that it's 2 out of those 3 groups. And that's what you use as those authentication methods. So I think one of the reasons why people struggle with this one is because they don't really necessarily understand multi-factor authentication. And then the second part too is I know that there have been a lot of individuals who have struggled with finding a multi-factor authentication tool that is also FedRAMP moderate or equivalent. So that's another thing that we need to just sort of throw into this conversation, is that a lot of these that people are struggling with can be, not always, but can be due to the fact that they're not paying as much attention to that FedRAMP requirement in the DFAR 7012 clause. And if you do not know about DFAR 7012, please right now, go watch our video on DFAR 7012 right now. However, for the rest of you who do understand DFAR 7012, it states that you have to use a cloud service provider who is either FedRAMP authorized or equivalent. So if you are in a situation where you pick like a random thing, like for example, Duo is a company that does multi-factor authentication. They have a version that is FedRAMP approved and a version that isn't. So I wouldn't surprise me if a lot of companies were like, well, this one that isn't FedRAMP approved is cheaper. I'm going to go with that, thinking that it was all going to be fine. And it isn't. So if you are doing multi-factor authentication, be very, very sure that it is FedRAMP moderate, either equivalent or approved, and that you know that, and you've had a conversation with that company and you have in your hands, evidence of that. That's very important. The other thing about multi-factor authentication is that sometimes people can get confused as to the definition overall of it, and that's where some of these problems come in. Like for example, if it's something I know and why can't I use 2 somethings I know? Why can't it be I go ahead and log in to this application and then it asks me for a PIN? Isn't that multi-factor authentication? No, that's 2 different types of authentication, but it's not a multi-factor authentication, because again, it has to be 2 out of those 3 groups of something you know, something you have, and something you are. You can't have 2 out of the same group. That's not going to fly. So those would be the 2 big stumbling blocks for sure. I can pretty much guarantee you from our audience out there. And then there's the question of how do we fix that? Well, make sure, like I said, as the example of Duo, if you have an example of a FedRAMP approved version and a non-FedRAMP approved version, please go with the FedRAMP approved version. Even if it's a little bit more expensive, it's going to save you so much money in the long run, because you're not going to end up in a situation where when you have an assessment done, DIBCAC or C3PAO comes to you and says, hey, you can't do this. This is, you're done. And this is one of those controls. I'm pretty sure that 3.5.3 is one of the controls that cannot be POAM'd. So this is the sort of like, this could fail you kind of situation. So definitely make really, really sure that you're paying attention to that. And also make sure you're paying attention to the types of multi-factor authentications that you are using internally, and make really, really sure that they are 2 different from 2 different of those 3 groups of what you know, what you have, and what you are.
Case closed.
Case closed.
Next requirement, 3.14.1. Please explain the identity report correct system flaws. How is that a not satisfied? First, explain, Ms. Vestal,
yes,
what it is that we are talking about here.
Sure, certainly. So this is in the System and Information Integrity.
Sorry, I prefer to be referenced as Judge ORB.
Yes, of course, Judge ORB. I apologize. So Judge ORB, this is in the System and Information Integrity family, which is one that can be problematic for people for sure. Systems and Communication Protection, which is where our number 1 FIPS came from, and also System and Information Integrity. Both those families can be very tricky for a lot of different people out there in the DIB. So the System and Information Integrity family has a lot to do with exactly what it sounds like. How is it that information is protected? This is actually talking about how you protect information from any sort of system errors or flaws. So you have to identify those flaws or errors, you have to report them, and then you have to have a remediation plan to correct all of them as well. So it's not just about, okay, you know what? I have this error that came up in the system. I'm just going to go ahead and fix it and I move on with my day. No, like you have to have a documented process for how you fix those things. You have to have a documented process for how you identify those things. And you have to have a documented process for how you report them. If that is not very clearly defined, you are not going to make it through this control. It has to be very clear. The objectives underneath this state very, very clearly that you have to identify the system flaw. You have to identify it within a specific established time frame that you as the organization decide on. You then have to have an established time frame for how long it's going to take to report this and how long it's going to take to remediate it. All of those need to be specific time frames. And for most people, obviously every incident or error or flaw is going to be different. So
can you give an example, Ms. Vestal, of a system flaw that could fall under this rubric?
Absolutely. So let's say that you have an internal system that you create that you sell to different customers. Maybe one of them is the DoD. Let's say it's some sort of database related item, and you come to find out that there is actually a vulnerability inside of that specific file. So you've created this database, everything's working well, but you discover that there is a flaw in the code that makes it so someone could basically take over the database. They could just get their way in. That would be an example of a system flaw. And how you identify it. Okay, how did that happen? How did I identify that flaw? Usually what most companies will have is some sort of standard sort of cadence of checking those things, either automated through some sort of external technology solution or a manual version. Either way is fine. Let's say a manual version. Maybe you have IT members who are, maybe your senior IT person, whoever that is, or your CIO, or whoever it happens to be. Maybe every week or every month, they have to go in and look at these specific systems. And you would have to define those systems. You'd also have to define what they were going to be looking at inside those systems. In our scenario with the database, you could say, this person is going to look at this database every 2 weeks at this time, or before this time, or before the end of the day, or however you want to say it. And whatever you define as that cadence and that standard process is what you better be doing. So if you have documentation for a process and that process is not actually being done that way, you need to either update the documentation or update the process. But you need to make sure that the documentation and the process itself are the same, because the C3PAO who comes in to do your assessment, or the DIBCAC if you're on a joint surveillance path, they will want to see the documentation and the process and how those two things marry together. So that's a really, really big one. You just have to, I guarantee you that a big reason why this is number 3 is because of the fact that people were not thinking, these OSCs were not thinking like that. Because what I just described is a very detailed process that's very thought out and very documented. A lot of companies are busy doing other things, and it's understandable.
They're not thinking about it.
We get it. They're not thinking about it. But I can pretty much guarantee you that that's the reason why this is so high up on this list of our top 10, is because of the fact that there just isn't that very intentional documenting of how we do this, when we do this, who does this, and how we handle it once it's happened.
Case adjourned.
I like it.
All right. I think we have covered our 3 out of the 10.
Mm-hmm.
ORB will be back on a future episode, on our next
Excellent.
episode, to go through these at further length.
I love it. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know that Orly's very sad that she missed you, but we're so glad you're here.
Thank you very much.
Very welcome.